Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's digital event, Digital Roundtable, hosted by the RevOps Co-op, where we are going to be talking all about Salesforce data models. And so I've got a couple of experts that are joining me on the panel today. So let me do some quick introductions before we dive into things. And also let me, I guess, before we do some introductions, want to do just some housekeeping things. So one, like I mentioned, we've got the chat. I asked y'all a couple of questions to throw in there first, curious where everyone's located, what your favorite flavor of M&M is as well. As we go through this discussion, we're going to be taking questions as we go, and definitely want this to be an interactive sort of dialogue back and forth. So throw any questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A button or box. And our panelists are going to, one, respond to things live over video, and also two, we'll be chatting back with you. So if you've got specific questions, nothing is too broad, nothing is too narrow. If you're like, hey, I use this type of opportunity record with these sorts of fields, you know, how does that compare to the things that you're recommending? Like, throw that stuff into the chat. We'll get everything that we can addressed today on the call, and anything that we don't, we'll make sure we follow up afterwards. So with that being said, let's go ahead, and I want to do some quick introductions with the experts that I have with me today. So first up, I have Demar Amacker, who is currently the Senior Director of Business Operations at Zift Solutions. Demar has been using Salesforce for a long time, and he's also been a very active member of RevOps Co-op from the very early days. So thank you, Demar, for being here, and appreciate you joining. Excited to get your take on things. And along with Demar, we also have Nati Beeri, who is the VP of Data at Sightfull. Nati is a former McKinsey consultant who was part of the Sightfull team from the very early days. And for those of you that don't know about Sightfull, they're an official partner of RevOps Co-op, and they are the first fully automated revenue analysis and optimization platform built for SaaS companies. In short, essentially what they do is they give revenue and RevOps leaders everything they need to create the ideal go-to-market plan from lead to renewal. So from top to bottom. I actually love their product, get excited about what they're building. But given Nati's background, he not only has kind of firsthand experience in this topic, but he's also seen how a bunch of leading SaaS companies are handling the exact topic that we're going to be discussing today: Salesforce, data models, best practices, and tips. So very excited to get his expertise on this as well. I already ran through the housekeeping stuff, so we don't need to get into that anymore. So I guess before we start to actually dive into some of the details, right, about Salesforce setup, best practices, you know, here's how to approach data models, things like that. I guess, Nati, I'm curious, and maybe you can pull up some of the visuals that you have here as well. I guess my first question is, like, why are data models important? Why should we care? Why do we need them? Why can't I just go into Salesforce and just start doing stuff, man? Like, that's all I want to do. So let's start there, and maybe, like I said, if you want to pull up some of the visuals you have to kind of support the that sort of question and some of the other ones we want to talk about, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've started sharing my screen. Let me make sure that everybody can see.
Yes, sir. We are good.
Perfect. So first, Matt, thank you for the introduction, and very nice to see everyone. Thank you for coming. I think, you know, the general premise for the discussion today, or the general premise for this webinar, is pretty simple. It's garbage in, garbage out. And that's, you know, a first statement anytime you work with data models, but it's specifically true when you're trying to build your SFDC org for a SaaS company. I think, ironically enough, given that Salesforce was the first SaaS solution out there in the market, it's simply not natively built to support SaaS selling motion, deal structure, or even the reporting out of the box. It's missing some important fields that, as we go along, I think everybody will say, well, obviously we need them, but they're just not natively there, and they're not supported in Salesforce. And to get the metrics that, you know, are both expected from us, from business stakeholders, from the CEO, the CRO, the board, when you come to raise equity and you come to raise debt, etc., but also the analysis that we need as RevOps professional to drive the business forward, to adopt this iterative approach to go to market and to understand what works and what doesn't. So to get this set of metrics and analysis, you need to proactively think ahead of time and to put in place the right data model to enable that. And that is both in terms of reliability of the results that you get, how accurate they are, how robust they are, but also in the level of sophistication, what type of analysis you're able to get out of it. And maybe, a couple of last thoughts here, and then I'm done with setting the premise, is this is often thought about as a tomorrow question. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that it's today's question. Things like correction, backfills, migration from another system, for example, HubSpot or Zoho to Salesforce, etc. These things are painful. And if you don't plan ahead for them, you're stuck with either difficulties to create continuity and reporting, or really painful backfills and correction. So yeah, it's a today's question. It's worth planning ahead. And the second thing is this, even when we talk about planning ahead, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to adopt the most complicated model from day one. I think as we go along, and we'll see different examples of models that we can use, these build on each other, and they eventually represent the trade-off, right? They represent the trade-off between simplicity and how time to value and how sophisticated they are. And you need to understand which is the right model for you at your point in your life cycle and your journey as a company, but make sure that you do it in the right way so you're able to build and adapt as both your needs grow and your capacity grows.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So so when we talk about data models, then I guess give us the starting point. What are the types of things that we can use, at least today, to walk through some data models, and then from there we could get into how we kind of can put those into maybe our current company, evaluate the current kind of setup things that we've got. But right, to me, data model can mean a bunch of different things. So how should we be looking at that, Nati?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in a second we're going to jump to maybe show some kind of framework. As I'm ashamed to say, I'm a former consultant, so I love frameworks, and I can introduce in a second. But
because they work.
Sorry, because they work, yeah, or at least they're a good structure for a discussion, I would say. I think when I'm thinking about data model, I'm thinking about how do I capture and store and also enrich the data in my source systems. In this case, it can be and we'll focus on SFDC, to both make my business and my sales team work and support their day-to-day work, but also lay the infrastructure and the groundwork to get the analysis I want afterwards. So in this case, in the discussion today, for example, I think we can cover some really practical grounds. Am I using opportunity? Am I using line items? Should I use the contract? Which fields are important for me to track? What is the pros and what is the cons of going to a more complicated model, etc. How should I approach field history tracking, and where is that useful? And that's something maybe I don't know how to use it in Salesforce, but I know how to use it in analytics down the line. So these are the type of questions that I think are worth keeping in mind when you think about data model. And everybody have a data model, whether or not they thought about it.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. So maybe, and again, as Matt said, feel free to interrupt with questions. It's not interruption, but to jump in with question at any point. I think this should be a basis for discussion more than anything else. Like the slides are here to support it, not anything, not other than that. In terms of an agenda for today, I'll quickly name drop, I think, a few of the metrics that are relevant for SaaS companies in general, and that the right data models, the data models that we'll go through today, will unlock for you and will enable. And for them, from there, I think we can jump directly into start discussing different models and see how they built on each other and what the pros and cons from each of them. And by the end of it, maybe some parting thoughts on some things to keep in mind, independent of which data model you've selected. Yeah, and again, let's make it into a discussion. So before I jump into the different models, I think all the models that we'll cover here cover a wide range of metrics. It goes all the way from, the top line ARR and retention metrics, which are the cornerstone of any SaaS analytics, and continue to bookings and rep performance, and actually to the beginning of the process, the pipeline and the funnel. What's the pipeline creation? How do they progress? What's the win rates? Where do we see blockage, etc. And now this is a very non-exhaustive list of things that can be done with the data that we're going to discuss. Not necessarily all of these can be done in Salesforce itself with the table and the reports that Salesforce enable. But if you use, I think, any of the data models that we'll discuss today, you have the necessary data and the necessary, you've done the necessary groundwork to either calculate them in Salesforce or to export them and then use it in another analytic solution. It can be Excel, it can be Python, it can be Sightfull for that matter. And that really lays the relevant groundwork here. Now, I will say as a side note, this, like the metrics, the list of metrics is not necessarily the focus of conversation today, but it's a good point to discuss. If you think that we're missing something, or if there's something that you're not sure about that you would have expected to see here, let us know. And B, it's one of my favorite dinner conversation topics. So if you'd like to brainstorm together or discuss it afterwards, I'm kind of a nerd of this, so happy to reach out and discuss offline as well.
Yeah. So, hey, Nati, can you go back to the last slide where you had the different models there? So I guess before we start to dive into some of these, Demar, I'm curious about your perspective because, right, you're a RevOps practitioner, you're sitting there, you've been using Salesforce, building in Salesforce. I think you have several maybe Salesforce certifications. So I don't know, I guess maybe my first questions for you are like, one, I think Nati mentioned whether or not you think you have one. Everybody has data models, right? Because like if you have Salesforce, you're using it today, and these are kind of three ways that you can look at it. So before we dive into the specifics of these, I guess I'm curious on your perspective from a practitioner of like, one, do you have documented data models or frameworks? And then two, I guess maybe depending on the answer to that question is, even if you don't, how do those thoughts that you have, or maybe the things you're doing in practice, necessarily align with the things you might see on the screen here about breaking things down across opportunity, product line, and contract?
Yeah, so I think for me, the hardest thing, I interface quite a bit with my board and my executive leadership team, and the hardest thing for me is when they ask me a question that I simply can't answer, because I could have answered it if we would have had the foresight and the data at the right time to be able to have the trended analysis to give them what they want, or we just don't capture the data in the way that they're asking for it. So I think as you scale and as you add different data points to your system, the source of that data is obviously critical, and documentation around differentiation of data sources, source of truth versus read only, understanding sort of like the different complexities of obviously Salesforce is a downstream and upstream sort of consumer of data, oftentimes within sitting in the larger sales tool ecosystem. Oftentimes, I think you have to have a way to both have sort of that CYA over time of covering the basis of what's there today. How can we chain, if we make changes, are those kept up with from a maintenance standpoint? But I think your point about documentation is very important, because if you're not documenting your data model, then you're obviously at a point where you're navigating in the blind, right? So I think having it clearly, someone coming in new to a role, having a sort of a lay of the land is very key to being able to sort of chart your next your next sort of plans for that data. So I think it's we don't all have the sort of fortunate circumstance to come in with a brand new data model that we can plan from. So I think having best practices as at the core, so that we're all moving around, but if you leave the next person that takes your your work in a better place because it's well documented and well sort of naming convention and things like that within your existing data set, it's going to be much easier to follow linearly, or some semblance of definition of that, because as you had on the last slide, garbage in, garbage out. At whatever point in the journey that you're entering that data, it needs to be decipherable for both upstream and downstream consumption.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think lines with Nati. I think some of the things you said of one, the reason why this stuff is important is because the data model that you set influences the data that you capture. The data that you capture influences what you can measure. What you can measure influences the outcomes that you're going to drive and the actions that you take, right? So it's all tied together. And Demar just gave one example of the last position you want to be in is having a board or an executive ask some question, and you have to say, I can't answer you because we simply don't have the data to look back and trend that information over the last several quarters, right? Where if you had that framework, if you had that data model, hopefully that stuff exists, even if you haven't measured it historically, right? It's there. So yeah, it makes tons of sense. So Nati, I'll turn it back over to you. I think maybe you were going to add something there, and then yeah, maybe we can dive into some of the specifics here, because I know opportunity model is something I'm very curious to kind of learn more about, and especially some of these other ones as we dive deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just before we dive deeper, to build on what Demar said, I think there is the question of how the safeguards that you introduce into the organization. So Demar mentioned documentation and naming practices, which I think are two very important ones. Other ones can be automation, for example, making sure that things are automatically populated and have robust sort of fallbacks, that if it hasn't been populated, then I'm taking from this and I'm taking from that. And also data hygiene controls to make sure that, for example, you can change close opportunities, you have anomalies detections, you use pick list instead of free text, etc. Because, and we'll see it as we go along, the more complicated the model becomes, you're more empowered as an analyst later down the line, and you have, these great tools for business continuity and reporting continuity. But the pitfalls where you can make mistakes and where human errors can happen also increases. So like you have a whole array of safeguarding that when you scale up your go-to-market and when you scale up your SFDC organization, I think they're worth keeping in mind. And that's exactly sort of what Demar has been pointing at.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's jump to the details. And I promised the framework, and here's the framework, or there's a spectrum. So earlier I mentioned, hey, all these models are going to be able to support, is going to support the metrics that I put on the screen. And then the next question is, okay, so what differentiates them? And I think effectively what differentiates the model, these archetypes of model that we're going to discuss today, obviously you can put a lot more in the spectrum between them, is the level of granularity in analysis that they offer and the robustness of calculations. In granularity, I mean exactly what Demar has mentioned effectively. It's, are you able to capture answers and provide answers at several different levels and segmentations and breakdowns, including historic analysis when you have this question, when you're faced with these questions from the board, or you as a RevOps leader want to explore this hypothesis on additional places for growth and remove bottlenecks, etc. And when I say robustness, I'm thinking about how reproducible, reliable, accurate, and explainable the reports that you're producing on it. Especially when you think about metrics such as ARR and NDR, which used to be, I think, almost vanity management metrics for a long time that CEOs looked at, and now are important considerations when you come to raising money, when you come to raising debt, when you think of some kind of an exit move, etc. And suddenly you need to open the hood and explain how exactly you calculate it, what is the granular data that supports it, and as you go right, as you shift right, if you will, on this spectrum, you'll become the robustness of your models is stronger and stronger, I think. And the trade-off that we're going to walk through today is pretty simple, to be honest. It goes from simplicity and time to value on the left-hand side, but limitation in terms of the metrics that you're able to, or not in the metrics, but the level of analysis and the detail that you can capture from them. And then to more robust models on the right-hand side. And specifically, I am going to put forward 3 models that I think we can discuss. Discuss the difference between them and also nuance and sort of where can you stop along the way. The first one is the opportunity model. And the idea there is to make as little as possible changes to the default SFDC that comes out of the box, just adding the bare minimum to make sure that you're able to support, to speak SaaS language, and you're able to support sort of SaaS contracts and SaaS deals, etc. Moving slightly to the right, there's the product line model, where you effectively leverage line items in Salesforce to take this lump sum of an opportunity and break it down into components that correspond with your business, with your go-to-market approach, and also with how you want your analytics to look like. And finally, all the way to the right is the contract model, where you adopt a more, let's say, you go one level higher. So instead of looking at it as an opportunity by opportunity, deal by deal perspective, you look at it as from an account view. How does my engagement with this account looks like? Which contracts are currently active? When are they renewing? A lot of things that have to do with core terming, early renewal, late renewal, grace to opportunities that are currently in negotiations, etc. Contract model really really opens that up. And maybe then just to wrap it up, and then let's open it. Sort of love to hear your thoughts on this. If I'm bringing it down to ground level and I'm thinking of a few examples, like practical examples, then if you are a small startup, you have one line item, you have only a couple of AEs, you're mainly a founder-led sales operations, like the founders are the one who is selling, and it's your CEO or CTO that sets up your SFDC, then maybe the opportunity is the right solution for you. Gets you off the ground really quickly, and you're able to start reporting to your board on SaaS metrics. But if you're already a slightly more mature startup, you have multiple products, you're looking to analyze white space, you want to understand upsell, maybe you have slightly more complex deal structure, it's well worth your time to use the product line, like in this specific example. And finally, if you think about the segment of scaling businesses, growth stage startups that already have complicated enterprise contracts, and quite frankly, a dedicated SFDC team, then maybe the contract model is the one that becomes more and more relevant for you. And that's the general idea. Demar, let me know, does that resonate more or less with how you view these things? What are we missing here with this model simplicity?
No, I think it tracks with, the complexity both of, and I just see a message in the chat about CPQ, right? I think that as you adopt a more complex sort of model for how you are understanding your business, your data has to keep up with that. But if you have to retroactively go back and again have to answer questions that you can't answer, I think it becomes more difficult. But I think it is, there is a sort of scale to this that as you need to answer more complex questions about your business and need to be more strategic in your placement of resources and things like that. I think having that granularity, via even something like a product line, right? Being able to do things like multi-year deals and things like that. For us, our data model is actually prohibitive of a transition into another sort of deal management, deal desk sort of setup, simply for this reason. It was, we were using fields on the opportunity record as opposed to products. So as you transition into the next model of, we need a deal desk, we actually have to shift our data model to be updated so that it's applicable to our next stage. And I think that's one where we actually saw the rubber hit the road of, as we shifted from needing a more complex way to report on it, we needed to shift our our infrastructure to support that as well.
And that can be a pretty painful migration, right? To start breaking down based on custom fields and opportunity to line items for X amount of years backwards.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And specifically, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask Nati. So yeah, like in my experience, did a lot, before when I was running BizOps and RevOps, started a small growing startup. That startup, kind of grew to Series B, Series C stage. Most of what we did was primarily on the opportunity object. And I'm getting ahead a little bit because I know what the next couple of slides look like. But a lot of the things that you're going to talk about on like, hey, here are these things that you can do on the opportunity object with contract start, contract end date, like that's a lot of what we did, right? Then we were like, oh, hey, we're SaaS, so we want people to renew. We should track renewal opportunities as well. And like, that was kind of how we migrated along. But even over that time frame from a team of 10 to like I said, a team of 150 people across the company, still like we didn't have CPQ, we didn't have I don't think we ever really graduated to like product line or contract.
Yeah.
Some of the questions we're getting in the Q&A are like, and that are kind of CPQ specific is like, okay, well, if you're like, maybe if you've got CPQ or you're looking at implementing CPQ, like where do you kind of fall on this spectrum? And even one specific question from Emily of like, does it make sense? Would it make sense in some cases to potentially move move contract ahead of product line, or maybe skip over product line to contract? So how can folks kind of think about where they are on the spectrum, given, since CPQ is, something that might sounds kind of top of mind, is, like, how does that interplay here from your perspective? Where can those folks look and figure out like where they kind of fit?
Yeah, so I can offer maybe 2 cents on CPQ and the integration here, and also the concept of leapfrogging the contract, or leapfrogging product line straight into the contract. I think CPQ is almost by definition something which will encourage you and will support you in starting producing line items to detail, sort of translate the contract translate the quote that you have into line items in SFDC. We usually, when I'm thinking about the portfolio and the companies that we're seeing at the moment, it's usually already comes with contracts built into SFDC, and that's maybe an important nuance, they're not necessarily leveraging everything that contract can give you from the point of view of business and reporting continuity. So CPQ is definitely, like, it goes without saying, that's the stage where you start breaking down the overall opportunity into line items. You can also do it without it, but if you implement CPQ, that's the very lowest hanging fruit that you get. And oftentimes that will also include contracts, but you need to go a slightly extra mile to think, how do I want to use contracts in my reporting, in my business workflows? Because that won't come out of the box with CPQ, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So, I guess, well, now I'm curious on, maybe if we start on the opportunity side, Nati, what are some, again, like I can tell you, back when I was at Ally, right? Like we were, opportunity object, no CPQ. We were basically what you described before, handful of account executives shifting from founder led to having a VP of sales and a couple of AEs. We were starting to have deals that we had to manage and trying to figure out how to measure them. And then again, because we were, hoping for renewals, we also had a customer success team who was starting to manage renewals. So I'm curious, what are some of those things that we can do to evaluate the opportunity object? I know one of the things that we always struggled with was the dollar value, right? Like, should you put MRR or ARR in the amount field? Should it be something else? What about multi-year deals? What if there's an early opt-out? All these questions around dollar value, what field to put it in, how that flows through to your reporting, and then how to actually understand different subscription types and different contract end dates, and how that stuff all kind of compares to the close date when the DocuSign happens, right? All that stuff. So I don't know, those are some of the things that are flowing through my head right now. Is one, I'm kind of curious on hey, stuff that I did, actually the stuff that an expert like Nati would recommend, and then for obviously anybody else on the call who's in that early stage position, and then from there maybe we can get into some of the product line and contract stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into it. And I think when we're thinking about the opportunity model, we need to think A, what enables you, and B, flowing for that, maybe where the opportunity model hits a limit, and when you need to think about line as well. And to be honest, from your description, it sounds like maybe you guys have been using it, past the time it could have been helpful to use that.
Probably.
And really braving through it, because I think that when you try to drag one of these models past sort of, to drag it along with you while your business maturity and go-to-market complexity is already past that stage, it can be like a difficult task. So kudos to you. It's not an easy thing to do.
I appreciate that. I'm not going to give myself a pat on the back though.
Okay, so again, the basic idea behind it is to get going really fast. So you're asking yourself, what do I need to have on my opportunity to be able to start speaking a SaaS language and be able to start reporting on things like ARR waterfall, NDR, average revenue per accounts, etc. And effectively, you have 2 very important components, and they're written here, in very simplified terms. But I think you already mentioned a few of the nuances, so let's go through the simplified terms and then jump into the nuances. One is the dates, and that's both when the billing starts, and I'm meaning billing or service, and that can be very different from from the close date of the opportunity, and how long or until when these two can be interchangeable, the contract is active for. Now, this combination together of the start and the end date, or the start and the contract length, is important for two things. Might be straightforward, but let's mention them anyhow. A, in terms of the recognition, in terms of calculating ARR itself. So you know what was the total deal size, what the total contract value, the TCV. If you want to annualize it, if you want to jump from there to an ARR terms, you have to have a very clear and, you know, a consistent, what is the duration of my opportunity? What is the duration of this deal? And it has to go through all of the opportunities. And we see not one, but we see several, like multiple SaaS companies that just don't track that, or they do track it, but it's somewhere in the PD, saved in the PDF, or it's saved somewhere in NetSuite, and it's not part of how they manage Salesforce. And the second thing, and I think you started to allude to that as well, is, okay, I have a TCV. Is all of this recurring? Because you're going to start facing these questions. Do you have any components there that can be partner fees? They can be deployment costs. They can be shipment, hardware, stuff like that. Do you have any components in your total deal size that are not recurring? And if so, it's important that you're able to distinguish them out, and you keep some kind of component that this is my recurring value. And then together you're able to start calculating ARR. Now, let me follow two more threads, and then let's also go through a little discussions. One is, what do you get, and when is it might be too much? What you're able to get is really quick setup time and really an ability to start saying, this is my ARR. The formula, if you have all of this, calculating, looking at exporting your Salesforce data, or even doing it in Salesforce itself and saying, this is my top line ARR, and this is how I break it down, this is how I explain it, is a very straightforward calculation to do. So this is your first wall into that. And once you have your ARR, you also have NDR and retention, renewal rates, etc. And what you don't get with this is a product segmentation. I think that's the example that Demar has given. Like you can force it, you can try to write, this product has got this component and this product has got this component, but it's very hard to translate into analytics afterwards. You have to do almost hard-coded queries. Doesn't matter if you do it on Salesforce or you do it somewhere else. And every time you add a new product, it doesn't filter through. So it's the support for multi-product. If you really want to, you're able to do it, but it's not a native support with your analytics further downstream. And the second thing, and I think this is something that you mentioned, Matt, is when you start to have multi-year deals, so price for year one, price for year two, price for year three, you either have to break it down to different opportunities, or you're not able to reflect the ramp up during the opportunity lifetime in this model. And this, as it's pretty intuitive, will really undermine your ability to show strong retention and to reflect the true NDR, the net dollar retention of your business, based on your opportunities. Now, obviously, everything can be done, but it won't be native with this model.
Yeah. So a couple of questions that I have, and a couple of things from the audience here too, Nati. So I guess hearing what you're saying, well, I guess first question on the dollar amount. So even in the simplest form, right? Let's just say you have like one product you're selling, annual subscriptions, but maybe in some cases you charge an implementation fee, in others you don't. So there's the default amount field on the opportunity. Should you use that as the TCV, or should you use that as the recurring value with maybe a separate field for whatever one shouldn't be there? That's first question. Let's start there.
Yeah, so I can tell you both what we see most often and potentially what I would suggest as best practice. What we see most often is that the amount will represent the TCV, and from there you can start either carving out what is recurring or calculating based on that the ARR, the annualized value as well. And I think the reason you see that is because, that was one of like my last slides here, is talking about the opportunity history object. So Salesforce has this treasure trove, or that's called this opportunity history, which automatically tracks all changes that you do to the close date, the stage name, and the amount of the opportunity, the default amount field. And if you have that, you're able to do a lot of point-in-time analysis about your pipeline, your funnel, how they changed, how they progressed, etc. And here, I think, is the kicker. So what do you put in this amount field that's automatically tracked by Salesforce? And the question here, I think, is what is the most important for your business from a go-to-market perspective, from a business perspective. Are you interested to selling the recurring value and you're not really interested in, say, understanding the TCV, or you're still building pipeline and thinking about pipeline creation in terms of TCV? If it's in terms of TCV, I would use the amount field for that. If you already know what I care about is the amount that will be charged in year one, or the ARR value, or even the MRR value, though MRR and ARR, they're very interchangeable, then I would use Salesforce capabilities and that built-in tracking option to whichever field is most important for you, and put the other one in a custom field.
Yep. Okay, good. And then the other question, and maybe this is this is also based on some of the feedback you mentioned for me earlier, is, dragging this along further than you should, is it sounds like, for example, multi-year deals with potentially just different prices for each particular year. It sounds like this model starts to get a little, maybe challenging once you start to enter in some of those variables. Is that right?
Exactly, because let's walk through this. Effectively, if you have multi-year deals and you want to represent it in this model, you have one of two options, right? You can either create a different opportunity to each one of them, which is cumbersome and confusing and can really ruin your pipeline creation metrics and ruin your close win rate and stuff like that. Or you can start using custom field for what is the price for year one, what is the price for year two, what is the price for year three, and filtering that into through your analytics layers afterwards can be really difficult. A lot of custom work and stuff like that. So I think that, once you either go multi-product or you go to multi-year deals, I will start considering the line items as a more native.
Yep. Okay. That makes sense. I mean, again, it aligns with why something like this is a great way to get people started. I think it also demonstrates probably how quickly companies can, or I should say should, potentially graduate from this model. So maybe we move on to I think what the product line model is next, because I think that's where a lot of people are also, kind of have more questions. I think it's where a lot of this like CPQ kind of questions, stuff like that are coming. So let's say that's the case. All right, startup's been around for a little bit. We've seen great growth. Everything's going really well. Now we've got multi-year deals, multi-products, implementation fees, professional services fees, SaaS product fees. Opportunity model broken, doesn't work anymore. Let's move on from that. Let's go into the product line model. How do I get that set up? What are the things to consider there?
Absolutely. I'll do a quick shout out to the questions. James asking about ARR versus RevRec. I don't know if we'll get to this today, but it's a fascinating discussion, and let's keep it even in the RevOps co-op Slack if you want.
Yeah.
It's a really cool discussion, and I think both analytics and from organizational politics almost kind of question. So we can discuss.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So let's dig slightly deeper. Absolutely. Let's dig slightly deeper with the product line. The idea here, I think, as we mentioned, as we already outlined, is to take this lump sum that we have in the opportunity and break it down into components that are meaningful from your business and go-to-market perspective. The two ones, and I think let's just carry on with these examples, but the two examples that we mentioned now here are breaking down into different products, I apologize, and breaking it down into sort of multi-layer pricing, whatever is the price for year one, price for year two, price for year three. Again, let's start with the simplified version. What is important to keep in mind on each one of these line items? One is the total price. That's a native, that's a default field for Salesforce, which effectively should represent, going back to the discussion of we had of what's the dollar value, should represent the portion of the TCV that is attributed to this component. That can be attributed to this product or attributed to this portion of the contract. The second thing is literally which product does it connect to. Usually the way it works here is with a product ID and default connection into that product object in Salesforce. And the third one, and that goes back to discussion about recurring versus non-recurring, is, well, whether this product is recurring. What we usually see is that's managed at the product level or even at the product family level. For example, all of my software is recurring, all of my implementation fees are non-recurring. And you can have several different products in that family and 7 different products in that family. And then from there, it's pulled into the line item. There are some places where we see it managed specifically at the line item, but we wouldn't recommend that, because it opens you up to human errors, input errors, etc. And if you change it in one place and you forgot to change it in all the relevant line items, it doesn't work. But if it filters from the product, you're much more sort of future-proof in that sense. And then the last component here, and that's, exclusively if you have these multi-year deals, is to take down the dates management that we've discussed at the opportunity level and start to manage them at the line item. And then here I would expect to see the same set of fields that we mentioned earlier, and they will have to be custom fields. That will be the start date. You can maybe use the service date, which is a default field for Salesforce, and then the contract length and or the end date. Again, to do the same kind of calculations that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that makes sense. Demar, I think maybe based on some of the stuff you were talking, it sounds like maybe, I don't know, you guys at Zift are like, is this kind of where you would say you all are, or are you at the contract model that we'll get to next? Just curious how this kind of fits with your experiences.
Yeah, so I'd say we're like transitioning from opportunity to product line. We're fairly mature, but I'd say because of the complexity additions like multi-year and things like that, we never really needed. It was kind of a lazy, like, let's just stay on this opportunity as long as we can. The data doesn't seem to like, and again, we were on the model you mentioned where we have an opportunity for every year. So again, it's possible to get the report you need, but it's hard.
Not ideal.
We've switched to, we're in the process of switching to a product line model, obviously using CPQ, where we have things like deal terms baked right into the right into the proposal, things like implementation fees that are one time versus versus the recurring revenue. So much more enabled proposal software, deal desk for our sales reps that's consistent and kind of locked down is really the name of the aim of the objective for us is making sure that for us we have a very complex implementation, and what the customer gets at that time is often essentially mapped during the sales process. So if they're not in lockstep with what's been sold via the quoting process, and that whole process breaks down once it gets to implementation, and then customer success obviously is impact. So if we don't set a good foundation with the first proposal that they get, with the expectations being clear of this is what implementation includes, this is what the product includes, like those are the things that with product line items allow us much more description, detail, out of the box.
Yeah. Can I ask, how often do you have expansion built into your deals? So effectively, this will be the price for year 1, this will be the price for year 2.
So quite often, because we have banded pricing, so we want to represent, if you were to grow into this banded model, or this band of pricing, year 2 it would look like this, so they can kind of model future years for the customer to understand really total cost of ownership.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the TCO is one very important aspect of it. And the second aspect is we alluded to that earlier. If you start calculating retention based on the year-by-year pricing, rather than I think net dollar retention based on the year-by-year pricing, and not based on the contracted amount that you had at the end of the deal, you're really I think giving a much better representation of how your business actually behaves. And B, which is always good, you're boosting up your NDR in a true and accurate way, because you actually have this expansion, only that you've signed this expansion in the beginning.
Right.
So from our experience, portfolio company that we've seen, that's also oftentimes a motivation to move from this one lump sum of the opportunity to a more detailed line by line kind of calculations.
And Nati, so I've got, I guess, 3 audience questions that I want to ask here, and then also know that we've got roughly 10 minutes. So I want to make sure we get to the contract model too. So I guess first question, and I guess these first two questions, they kind of tie, I think they're relevant whether you're on the kind of this product line model or opportunity model. Eliza was asking, and this is kind of relates to call it how the opportunities tie to the account objects. So Eliza was asking single location accounts versus multi-location accounts. One opportunity per location, one opportunity per account for like the whole group. How should folks think about that? Let me ask that question and just that question first.
Can I raise the stakes even higher?
Oh yeah.
A single account or multiple accounts for a location per account? And the answer,
I don't even know. I don't even know how to tie those things together.
And the answer, I think, has a lot to do with your go-to-market motion, with your sales motion. Is it the same? Is it the same opportunity owner? Is it the same sales team? Do you have the same products? Or is it the same CS team, by the way, that have to worry about the renewal a year down the line or 2 years down the line? If you have the same account owner, independent of geographic location, then I would keep it as the same account. But if you have to break it down into, you want to have a very close link between how you build your Salesforce and how you build your data model and how your business actually operates. So you're able to report on things like quota attainment per region and per manager, on retention per manager, etc. And breaking them down to different accounts really enables you to do that. If you do that, though, you have to use another cool feature of Salesforce, and that's the parent account relationship. You have to make sure that you identify that you are identifying who's the parent of this account. Again, to make sure that down the line, downstream of the analytics, you're able to do, okay, give me the AR waterfall at the parent account level. Give me NDR at the parent account level. And oftentimes you want to be able to report, for example, report to the board at the parent account level, but hold the original managers and your sales team managers accountable at the account level. Does that make sense? And I think the opportunity discussion is just another level of the same discussion, of the same.
Yeah, I think the probably the most important aspect of that, Nati, is like you said, tie everything to the way that you execute or the things that you do, right? So is the same salesperson selling to the same buyer for a bunch of different locations, right? Mm-hmm. It's one opportunity. That's one deal. Do you have 12 different salespeople selling to 12 different location heads? Right? Like that's 12 separate deals, 12 separate opportunities. And I think, again, it ties back to why you want your analytics to drive, the outcomes, the measurable outcomes that you can say, what actions you can take to influence those things. Because the last thing you want to know is like, oh, great, so I've got one opportunity for all these 12 locations, but like 12 different people are, selling into this particular account. Like that's not going to give you anything valuable. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the other questions, Nati, is from Marcos, was on, I think just in general, a lot of what we're talking about is the, again, like the selling motion. So naturally, people already asked about CPQ, but what about just forecasting in general? Like how do these things kind of influence the way that companies can forecast and kind of evaluate pipeline, predict where they're at, what's going to actually be coming in the door? Bit of a loaded question, I know, but I'll ask for your quick take on that.
Yeah, I'll give my quick take, and then I think it will be really interesting to hear Demar's view on this as well, because mine, I think, will be mostly driven by analytics, and I think it's also an interesting question, from a business perspective, and the cadence that you have around Monday morning meeting, the sales rep is meeting his team, his manager, and they need to understand, is this in the forecast? Is this not in the forecast? So I would say this. I think two things that are oftentimes under leveraged in Salesforce is stage names properly, that you need to have very clear definitions and very clear criteria to how you move from one stage to the next. And the second one is forecast categories. That are built into Salesforce and allow you to say, okay, this is my forecast, this is my best case, and this is just in the pipeline. And I think that if you combine these two native capabilities into Salesforce and use the relevant close date for each quarter, and making sure that you're only looking at the quarter that's currently active, and adding to that trackage of pipeline that's been slipped out of the quarter and pipeline that's been pulled into the quarter. And that's the last end for this combination, making sure that you're able to segment, as we said in the beginning, based on your business requirements. So making sure that you're able to look only on the component of the pipeline that's relevant for this sales team and only on the component of the pipeline that's relevant for this region. Then you're able to have a pretty strong forecast sort of status quo. And I'm not trying to talk about predictions, but just managing the forecast cadence inside Salesforce, I would say. It might have been too many caveats in one answer, and if it was, I apologize.
No, I mean, I like that. Demar, before I let you kind of add your practitioner perspective, I think tie it back to even some of the stuff we were talking about up front is like documentation and clear definitions, right, of what it takes to move stage to stage is something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily have today. And again, the other thing that sounds obvious that we just talked about was tying it to your go-to-market motion, right? So like, I don't know, like look at your current pipeline stages and map them to the things that the actions that people will take, that sales reps will take to move things from stage to stage. And if you can't clearly do that, I think that's where you get into some of those, potential challenges. But Demar, I'll let you kind of add your take on that too.
Yeah, so I was going to go a little bit of a different direction just from an operational standpoint, and it's the level of depth, both from analytical on the kind of back end, because if you're using the forecast model in Salesforce, obviously you're able to really see a deeper level of like, for example, if you're not using product lines and or contracts, the level of granularity stops at the amount field which you're tracking, right? But if you understand at a deeper level the product values and sort of the nuance behind that, as those underlying changes happen over the course of a deal cycle, you have that breadth of variety and variance to your pipeline forecast as well. So if a massive implementation gets discounted and you have that represented as far as a discounting lever within your product line, you can see exactly where that impacts deals. And then something that we've done is actually taken that product line ARR and looked at it and seen, where the most fees are coming from by product. And I just don't think you can get that level of granularity as far as both the level of analysis for those that want to understand the best use of resources and just overall as Matt said, go-to-market strategy with regards to are you discounting too much for XYZ at the front end where you shouldn't be. You just can't get that level of granularity unless you can slice and dice that amount field by the cuts that underlie it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So I know, and so Nati, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to the contract model, and specifically, I guess, two questions I've seen come in that as you're going through this, if you can kind of talk about is one, variable or transactional revenue, right? So, hey, you sign up for a 12-month annual subscription with us. Guess what? We do usage-based pricing, and that could change, over the course of, any given month. That was one thing, and then the other thing is amendments to contracts or changes to contracts midterm. So give us a lowdown on the contract model here, and if you can add in some perspective on those things, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, let me start maybe from the second one that you mentioned, and then I think the first one is a contentious, like it's a big issue. So maybe just comment about it, and then try to work through it offline on a different occasion. But I think in terms of the amendments, I think that's the sweet spot of products when you think about business management and reporting continuity, because everything that has to do with core terming an opportunity and then maybe early renewal or late renewals, contracts give you a very powerful set of capabilities to use them. So effectively, what are we thinking about contracts when we're saying them is, instead of looking at it by opportunity, I have one new business opportunity, I have an upsell opportunity, sometimes I have a renewal opportunity. You start thinking about it from the account perspective. Which contract do I currently have active? Which opportunities are associated with it? And which contract or which opportunity replaces this current contract? And at each point in time, from the account perspective, you have one active contract, and that is the one you're going through. And if you have an upsell now, which is not a renewal opportunity, is just an upsell, you link it to that, like you effectively have an amendment, you have an upsell opportunity, you link it to the same contract, you have the automation and the data hygiene protection in place in Salesforce to make sure it's co-termed with the existing opportunities on that contract. And then when it's time to get a renewal, first, you know what the renewal date, because they're all co-termed. You get the alerts inside your Salesforce because you've set, you know, the amount of time before renewals that you want to get set, that you're going to get alert. And you're also able to very accurately understand what the renewal amount, what should be the sum to represent the whole contract, the whole engagement currently with the account. And that's also very impactful for calculations such as renewal rate, etc. So I think it was a great question because it touches at the heart of what we see from our perspective, contracts enable you. From an analytic robustness perspective, is this managing amendments, managing upsells and co-terming, and managing renewals, both when they're early and when they're late. And quite frankly, when they happen on time as well, which is rare.
Great.
And then the second one was the variable versus transactional question, which I think is maybe not even a data model question, is a business model question, right? On how like transactional variable ARR really allows you to maybe maximize from usage and giving more flexibility to the client, but it doesn't give you the same kind of multipliers that you get on recurring revenue. And then the question of how you translate a consumption-based or variable revenue into ARR in analytically robust way is a fascinating question. That's a topic for another time, but it's really interesting one.
Maybe that can be another separate roundtable event that we do, because I'm sure we could talk about that alone for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Good. All right, so yeah, wrap it up here, Nati, and then I'll do some kind of wrap up stuff to close us out.
Absolutely. So first, let me say thank you. It's been a lot of fun, and hopefully we can do it again. Second, a couple of things that I need to say before Tamar, our VP of Marketing, will kill me on Slack. One is that everything we just saw now is effectively a summary of the ebook that we're publishing, and we're going to send out to everyone. So it literally goes into, if here it was just, you know, the top lines and a few example of fields, there we go in much more in depth into what you need to think about, which fields are important to keep, etc. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I think that was the main thing I wanted to say. Finally, in terms of on the subject matter, we've talked about usage op history. We talked about segmentation. I think it's a great point that Demar has mentioned. Migration points kept up. Also, what happens when you do manual workflows. So the last thing I'll touch on here is that everything we just talked about is a really important first step, but it's a first step towards building an effective analytics engine in your organization. The second layers the subsequent layers that you need to think about is how do you do automation of exports? What is the analytics solution that you're using in terms of, you know, does it work for everyone in the organization? And also visualization, how do you empower business users? So like this is a great first step, and then you need to start building on that to really transform data culture, I think, in the organization. Yeah,
that's good. Well, this was awesome, Nati, Demar. Thank you very much for your expertise here. As Nati said, Tamar and the Sightfull crew is going to follow up with everybody after this. Make sure you get that ebook, lay out a lot more details on all these topics. I want to second what Nati just mentioned here. Use op history, track key field changes, time stamp, everything. And you can also find Nati and the rest of the Sightfull crew in RevOps Co-op. I did see a question about the Slack group. Just sign up for RevOps Co-op online. If you're not a member already, you can interact with these folks directly in there and elsewhere. So thank you again, Nati, Demar, really appreciate it. Everyone who attended, thank you very much as well. And I will let you all run and see you on the flip side. So take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.